power trip, a badge, a lethal combination when pinned to the wrong chest. Officer Brendan Foley thought he was king of the midnight shift, especially when he cornered two exhausted black men in a greasy spoon diner. He wanted an easy arrest. Instead, he blindly walked into a career-ending trap. The neon sign of Frankie's Copper Kettle buzzed with a rhythmic, dying hum, casting harsh pink and blue shadows across the wet asphalt of the parking lot. It was 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The city was asleep, but the diner was a sanctuary for the sleepless. Long-haul truckers, third-shift factory workers, and those who operated entirely in the shadows, sitting in the corner booth, nursing mugs of black, tar-like coffee, were two men who belonged to the latter category, or at least, that was exactly what they needed everyone to believe. Malcolm Hayes leaned his head against the cold window pane, his eyes bloodshot and heavy. He wore a faded, oversized black hoodie, a heavy gold chain resting against his collarbone, and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. Across from him sat Tyrone Evans, sporting a worn leather jacket over a torn graphic tee, a faux scar etched carefully over his left eyebrow, and a pair of bulky boots that had seen better days. To anyone walking through the doors of the Copper Kettle, they looked like mid-level street enforcers, guys you cross the street to avoid. That was by design. Malcolm and Tyrone were 14 months deep into Operation Iron Tide, a joint task force investigation into a massive narcotics ring controlling the city's eastern ports. They were undercover detectives, and their covers were flawless. They had bled for this case, missed family birthdays, and walked a razor's edge every single day. Tonight had been a 14-hour marathon of clandestine meetings and narrowly avoided shootouts. They just wanted a plate of greasy hash browns and a moment of peace before heading back to their miserable, roach-infested safe house. I swear, Ty, if I have to listen to Jimmy the Rat complain about his cut one more time, I'm going to blow my own cover just so I can arrest him for being annoying, Malcolm muttered, rubbing his temples. Tyrone let out a low, raspy chuckle, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. Just 3 more days, Mal. The shipment drops on Friday. We get the stash, we get the boss, and then I am sleeping for a month. Before Malcolm could reply, the bells above the diner door jingled aggressively. The heavy glass door swung open, and the atmosphere in the room instantly shifted. In walked Officer Brendan Foley. Foley was a 15-year veteran of the patrol division, a man who wore his uniform a size too tight and carried himself with the swagger of a small-town sheriff from a bygone, less accountable era. He had a reputation in the precinct, one that the Internal Affairs Division had been circling for years, though they had never quite managed to pin him down. Foley was known for his proactive policing, a thinly veiled euphemism for targeting minorities, escalating minor infractions, and throwing his weight around when he knew there were no cameras rolling. Shirley, the night waitress who had been wiping down the counter for the last hour, stiffened. "Evening, Officer Foley. The usual?" she asked, her voice tight. "You know it, Shirley. And make it fresh. None of that sludge from the bottom of the pot," Foley barked, resting his hand casually on his duty belt as he scanned the room. His eyes swept past a snoring trucker, skimmed over a couple of college kids sharing a milkshake, and slammed to a halt on the corner booth. He locked on to Malcolm and Tyrone. Tyrone caught the look from the corner of his eye. He didn't turn his head, merely took a slow sip of his coffee. "Don't look now," Tyrone murmured to his partner, his lips barely moving. "But we've got a uniform eyeing us, like we're steaks at a dog show." Malcolm kept his gaze fixed on his coffee mug. "Just play it cool. We're Jamal and Trey tonight. Don't give him a reason to walk over." But Foley didn't need a reason. He needed an audience, and he needed to assert his dominance. He grabbed his styrofoam cup of coffee from Shirley without leaving a tip, adjusted his utility belt, and began a slow, deliberate walk across the checkered linoleum floor. The heavy thud of his boots echoed in the quiet diner. "Here we go," Tyrone sighed internally. He subtly reached into his jacket pocket, his thumb brushing against the small, concealed recording device he wore for the narcotics sting. With a quiet click, the wire was live. Everything Foley was about to do was going straight onto a secured server. Foley stopped at the edge of their booth, looming over them. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes darting between Malcolm and Tyrone, sizing them up with undisguised contempt. "Late night for you boys to be out," Foley stated, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Malcolm looked up, keeping his expression neutral, playing the part of a weary street-level hustler, trying to avoid trouble. "Just getting some food, officer. Long shift." "Shift doing what?" Foley sneered, leaning a hand heavily on the edge of their table. "You boys don't exactly look like you just clocked out of the steel mill. Matter of fact, you look a lot like a couple of suspects I heard about over the radio. Few burglaries, 2 towns over." It was a blatant lie. Tyrone knew the scanner chatter. There hadn't been a burglary call all night. It was the classic pretext, the oldest trick in the book of corrupt policing, used to justify an illegal stop. "We haven't been 2 towns over, man," Tyrone said, letting a hint of street vernacular slip into his voice to maintain his alias. "We've been on the east side all night, just stopped for some hash browns." "I didn't ask for your life story, pal," Foley snapped, his face flushing with immediate anger at the slight pushback. "I asked what you're doing here. This is a quiet neighborhood. People don't like seeing your type rolling through here at 3 in the morning looking to case the joint." The racial subtext was as subtle as a sledgehammer. The 2 college kids at the counter stopped talking, their eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. Shirley stood frozen by the coffee pots, a look of helpless guilt on her face. "Our type?" Malcolm asked, raising an eyebrow. It was a risky move, but as a seasoned detective, Malcolm wanted to see exactly how far Foley was willing to dig his own grave on tape. "What type is that, officer?" Foley's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. He hated being questioned. He thrived on fear, and these 2 men weren't showing any. "The type that causes trouble," Foley growled. "Let's see some ID. Both of you." Right now, this presented a massive tactical problem. Malcolm and Tyrone were carrying driver's licenses, matching their undercover aliases, Jamal Washington and Trey Collins. They were deep-cover credentials, designed to pass a standard DMV check if pulled over by a patrol car, linking back to backstopped criminal records built by the Bureau. If they showed their real police badges, they would instantly blow their cover. Jimmy the Rat had eyes everywhere, and word of 2 cops dining at the Copper Kettle would spread to the syndicate by sunrise. Their 14-month operation, and likely their lives, would be over. They had to play the scene out as Jamal and Trey. Tyrone let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, reaching slowly into his back pocket to retrieve his fake wallet. "All right, man. No need to get hyped. Here." He tossed the driver's license onto the table. Malcolm did the same. Foley snatched the cards off the table, holding them up to the dim diner light. He scrutinized the names, the addresses, the photos, looking for any excuse. "Jamal and Trey," Foley read aloud, dripping with sarcasm. "What a surprise. You boys have any warrants? Anything in your pockets that's going to poke me when I search you?" "You don't have probable cause to search us," Malcolm stated firmly, keeping his hands flat on the table where Foley could see them. "We're sitting in a booth, drinking coffee. I've got all the cause I need right here." Foley tapped his shiny badge. "You match the description of 2 prowlers. That gives me reasonable suspicion to detain and identify. Now, I'm going to take these IDs out to my cruiser and run them. You 2 keep your hands planted exactly where they are. If you twitch, you're going face down on this dirty floor." Foley turned on his heel and marched out of the diner, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. Tyrone looked at Malcolm, a muscle ticking in his jaw. "He's running the aliases. They'll come back clean. Just a couple of old misdemeanors we baked into the profile." "It won't matter," Malcolm whispered back, his eyes fixed on the cruiser idling outside. "Guys like him, they don't care if the paper is clean. He's decided we don't belong here. He's going to find a way to hook us up. If he tries to arrest us, we'll have to break cover, Mal. We can't go to lockup. We have a meet with the cartel contact at noon." I know, Malcolm said grimly. Let's just pray he tells us to kick rocks and leaves it at that. The Wire is catching all of this. Internal Affairs is going to have a field day with this tape. Outside, inside the warm cabin of his cruiser, Officer Foley typed the names into his mobile data terminal. The system chewed on the data for a second before spitting back the results. Jamal Washington, Trey Collins. Valid licenses. Prior arrests for possession. No active warrants. Foley slammed his fist against the steering wheel. Clean. It infuriated him. He looked through the diner window at the two men sitting calmly in the booth. They weren't intimidated. They were defying him just by existing in his patrol sector. Not tonight, Foley muttered to himself. He keyed his radio. Dispatch. This is Unit 4. Adam. I need an additional unit at Frankie's Copper Kettle. Code 2. Got 2 non-compliant suspects. Uncooperative. Foley grabbed his heavy metal flashlight, stepping out of the cruiser. He wasn't going to let them finish their coffee. He was going to drag them out in cuffs, charge them with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, maybe sprinkle a little something in the back seat of his cruiser to make a felony charge stick. He had done it before. It was easy. The diner door swung open again, and Foley marched straight back to the booth, throwing the fake IDs onto the table. They clattered against the coffee mugs. All right, that's it. Get up, Foley barked, unsnapping the retention strap on his holster, a deliberate and terrifying gesture of escalation. Party's over. You're both leaving. Right now. Tyrone didn't move. We haven't finished our food, officer, and you haven't told us what crime we've committed. The crime is trespassing, Foley lied, his voice rising to a shout. Management wants you out, Shirley, trembling by the register, squeaked out. I never said that, officer. Shut your mouth, Shirley, Foley roared, pointing a finger at her. He turned back to the two detectives, his hand dropping from his gun down to his handcuffs. I'm giving you 3 seconds to stand up and put your hands behind your backs. 1. Tyrone locked eyes with Malcolm. The undercover gig was hanging by a thread. The syndicate was watching. But Foley had crossed the point of no return. Tyrone's hand slowly drifted toward the inside of his jacket. Not toward a weapon, but toward the shiny silver detective's shield pinned to his inner pocket. 2. Foley yelled, taking a step closer, pulling the steel cuffs from his belt, utterly blind to the absolute hellfire he was about to bring down upon his own head. 3. Officer Brendan Foley spat the word out like a curse, his hand closing around the cold steel of his handcuffs. In the fraction of a second between Foley lunging forward and the cuffs coming out, a silent, complex conversation occurred between Malcolm Hayes and Tyrone Evans. It was a language spoken entirely through micro-expressions, a tightening of the jaw, a slight shift in posture, honed over 14 months of trusting each other with their lives. Tyrone's hand was inches from his hidden detective's shield. All he had to do was pull it out, but Malcolm gave a microscopic shake of his head. No. Malcolm had run the tactical calculus. If they flashed their badges right now, Foley, already running hot and desperate for a confrontation, might panic. A corrupt, adrenaline-fueled cop who suddenly realizes his prey is armed and undercover is a highly unpredictable threat. Foley might draw his weapon and claim they reached for a gun. Furthermore, blowing their cover in the middle of Frankie's Copper Kettle meant the syndicate would know by morning. Operation Iron Tide would be dead, and the cartel boss would slip away again. But there was another reason Malcolm kept his cover intact. They were wearing a wire. Everything Foley was doing was broadcasting to a secure server at the Organized Crime Task Force headquarters. If they let Foley hang himself, they wouldn't just be saving their operation. They'd be taking a dangerous predator off the streets for good. Malcolm raised his hands slowly, palms open and empty, pressing them flat against the Formica table. All right, officer. We're complying. No one is resisting. Shut up, Foley roared. He didn't want compliance. He wanted a fight to justify the rage boiling in his veins. He grabbed Tyrone by the collar of his leather jacket and violently yanked him out of the booth. Tyrone, heavily muscled and perfectly capable of dropping Foley in 3 seconds flat, forced himself to go limp. He stumbled forward, allowing Foley to slam him chest first onto the sticky diner counter. Shirley let out a muffled shriek, clapping her hands over her mouth as half-empty coffee mugs shattered on the floor. "Stop resisting," Foley yelled, driving his knee into the back of Tyrone's thigh, a textbook pain compliance strike used entirely out of context. He violently wrenched Tyrone's arms behind his back, ratcheting the metal cuffs down so tightly they instantly bit into Tyrone's wrists, drawing a thin line of blood. "I am not resisting, officer," Tyrone said, keeping his voice dead calm, deliberately speaking clearly for the concealed microphone. "My hands are behind my back. I am fully compliant." Foley shoved him aside and turned his weapon hand toward Malcolm. "On the ground. Face down. Now." Malcolm smoothly slid out of the booth and lowered himself to the greasy linoleum floor, lacing his fingers behind his head. Foley dropped his full body weight onto Malcolm's back, driving his knee painfully into the detective's spine. Just then, the diner door burst open. Officer Jim Paulson, a younger cop with only 2 years on the force, rushed in with his hand on his holster. He stopped short, taking in the scene. 2 men already subdued, neither fighting back, while Foley knelt on one, like he was wrestling a wild animal. "Foley, what's the status?" Paulson asked, his voice tight, eyes darting around the empty diner. "Got 2 scumbags resisting?" Foley panted, slapping the cuffs onto Malcolm's wrists. "They took a swing at me when I asked for ID. Unbelievable." "Officer Paulson, my name is Jamal Washington," Malcolm said from the floor, projecting his voice. "I want it on the record that neither of us touched Officer Foley. We complied with every order. This is a false arrest." "Shut your mouth." Foley hauled Malcolm to his feet by the handcuff chain, causing a sharp jolt of pain to shoot up Malcolm's shoulders. Foley looked at Paulson. "Don't listen to this garbage, Jim. Help me get them to the cruiser." As they were marched out of the diner into the freezing night air, Tyrone managed a subtle, practiced movement. His hands were cuffed behind his back, but his fingers could just reach the customized smartwatch strapped inverted on his wrist. With 2 blind taps, he activated a silent distress protocol. Code 8. 42nd Precinct. The signal pinged directly to the encrypted phone of Captain Hector Reyes, the commander of the Organized Crime Task Force. Foley shoved them both into the cramped, hard plastic back seat of his cruiser. He slammed the door shut and walked around to the driver's side, a smug grin plastered across his face. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch. 4. Adam. I'm 10 to 15 with 2. Transporting to the 42nd for processing." The drive to the precinct was a masterclass in civil rights violations, and the wire caught every single agonizing second of it. Foley adjusted his rearview mirror to glare at them. "You boys really thought you could come into my sector and play tough? You think because you're wearing fancy chains and leather you run this city?" "We were just eating," Tyrone said quietly. "Yeah? Well, now you're going to be eating jail food for the next 5 years, Foley sneered, leaning over the steering wheel. "Assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, disorderly conduct, and you know what? You look like dealers to me. In fact, I'm pretty sure I saw you drop a baggie of fentanyl under the seat just now." In the back seat, Malcolm and Tyrone exchanged a look in the shadows. Foley had just verbally threatened to plant Class A narcotics on them. It was the holy grail of internal affairs evidence. It was an automatic, undeniable federal felony. "You're going to plant drugs on us?" Malcolm asked, ensuring the question was recorded clearly. Foley laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I don't have to plan anything. I'm a decorated officer with 15 years on the job. You're a couple of street thugs. When we get to the station, I'll find a brick of fentanyl in this cruiser, and a judge will take my word over yours every day of the week and twice on Sunday. You're done." Foley had no idea he was a dead man walking. The 42nd Precinct at 4 a.m. was a purgatory of flickering fluorescent lights, the smell of stale coffee, and the dull hum of ancient air conditioning units. Foley dragged Malcolm and Tyrone through the heavy double doors, parading them past the front desk like hunting trophies. Desk Sergeant O'Malley, a tired man 50 days away from his pension, peered over his reading glasses. "What do we have here, Foley?" O'Malley asked, rubbing his eyes. "Couple of heavy hitters trying to tear up Frankie's diner," Foley bragged, leaning against the high desk. "Took a swing at me. Hit him with aggravated assault on an LEO, resisting and loitering. Oh, and put a hold on processing their property. I need to do a thorough sweep of my cruiser. I have probable cause to believe they ditched narcotics in the back seat." O'Malley looked at Malcolm and Tyrone. In his 30 years on the job, he had seen thousands of violent offenders. These two didn't fit the profile. They were standing perfectly still, utterly calm, their eyes scanning the room with the calculated detachment of seasoned professionals. They weren't panicking about the drug charges. They were just, waiting. "All right," O'Malley sighed, grabbing a stack of booking forms. "Put 'em in holding cell 3. I'll get to their prints in 20 minutes. It's a busy night. Enjoy the cage, boys," Foley whispered, shoving them down the concrete hallway toward the holding cells. The heavy iron bars slammed shut with a definitive, echoing clang. Foley walked away, whistling a tuneless melody, heading for the break room to brag to the rest of the shift. Inside the cell, Tyrone leaned against the cinder block wall. "If O'Malley puts our prints into live scan, the system flags our federal clearance. The local system will freeze, and rumors will spread through the precinct." "Reyes got the ping," Malcolm said confidently, staring through the bars. "He won't let it get that far." Across the city, Captain Hector Reyes was already moving like a freight train. He had been ripped from a dead sleep by the distress ping, but the moment he logged into the secure server and heard the live audio feed from Tyrone's wire, sleep evaporated. He listened in cold, furious silence as Officer Foley threatened to plant fentanyl on his two best undercover men. Reyes didn't call the 42nd Precinct. He called Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins of Internal Affairs. Jenkins had been trying to build a corruption case against Brendan Foley for 2 years. Foley had a history of excessive force complaints from minority neighborhoods, but he was protected by a thick blue wall of silence and always knew where the cameras were blind. Jenkins. Reyes had barked into his phone as he sped through red lights. "I have him. Foley. He just falsely arrested Hayes and Evans, and he's on a federal wire threatening to plant narcotics. Meet me at the 42nd. We are ending this tonight." Back at the precinct, Foley was pouring his second cup of coffee in the break room, laughing with Officer Paulson. "I'm telling you, Jim, you got to establish dominance early," Foley was saying, taking a sip of the bitter brew. "These guys, they prey on weakness. You show them who holds the leash, and they fold. I'll write up the assault report. You just sign off as the witnessing officer." Paulson shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't actually see them swing at you, Brendan." Foley's eyes hardened. "You saw the aftermath, Jim. We protect our own. You back my play, or you're going to find yourself doing foot patrol in the winter." Before Paulson could answer, the break room door swung open. It was Sergeant O'Malley, looking pale. "Foley, Captain Donahue wants you in his office." "Now?" Foley rolled his eyes. "Probably wants to give me a commendation. Keep my coffee warm, Jim." Foley adjusted his belt, puffed out his chest, and marched down the hall toward the precinct commander's office. He knocked once and pushed the door open, flashing a confident, easygoing smile. "You wanted to see me, Cap?" Foley's voice died in his throat. Captain Donahue was sitting behind his desk, his face grim, rubbing his temples as if fighting off a massive migraine. But he wasn't alone. Standing to his right was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a sharp civilian suit, wearing a gold badge on his belt that did not belong to the local precinct. Standing to his left was a woman in a trench coat, holding a thick manila folder. Foley recognized her instantly. Lieutenant Jenkins, Internal Affairs. The air in the room felt suddenly thick, suffocating. Foley's arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. "Shut the door, Foley," Captain Donahue ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. Foley closed the door mechanically. "Captain? Is there a problem?" I just brought in 2 violent suspects. Stop talking, Donahue snapped. He gestured to the man in the suit. This is Captain Hector Reyes, commander of the Regional Organized Crime Task Force. Reyes stepped forward, his dark eyes boring into Foley, with an intensity that made the corrupt patrolman physically take a step back. Officer Foley, Reyes said, his voice smooth, but laced with venom. I believe you have 2 of my men in your holding cell. Foley blinked, confused. Your men? No, sir. There must be a mistake. I arrested 2 gangbangers, Jamal Washington and Trey Collins. They assaulted me at the Copper Kettle. Lieutenant Jenkins stepped forward, dropping the thick manila folder onto Donahue's desk with a heavy thud. She didn't look angry. She looked completely, utterly triumphant. Their names are Detective Malcolm Hayes and Detective Tyrone Evans, Jenkins said coldly. They are highly decorated, deep-cover operatives working a 14-month federal narcotics sting. And you, Officer Foley, just jeopardized a multi-million-dollar investigation because you wanted to play tough guy at a diner. Foley's mind went blank. The blood rushed from his head. Detectives? Undercover? It was impossible. He had checked their IDs. They were clean. They had fake IDs, Foley stammered, the first crack in his armor appearing. They resisted. They took a swing at me. Paulson saw it. Don't bring Officer Paulson into your lies, Reyes interrupted. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen and set it down on the desk. You see, Foley, my detectives are wearing a Title III federal wiretap. It records everything to a secure cloud server the moment it's activated. Reyes pressed play. The pristine, high-definition audio filled the silent office. The crime is trespassing. I'm giving you 3 seconds to stand up. Foley heard his own aggressive, unhinged voice. Then came the sounds of the struggle, the brutal slam against the diner counter, and Malcolm's calm voice. I want it on the record that neither of us touched Officer Foley. We complied with every order. This is a false arrest. Foley felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. Cap, out of context. That sounds bad, but keep listening, Jenkins said. Her eyes locked onto him like a sniper. The audio shifted to the hollow acoustics of the police cruiser. Assault on a police officer. Resisting arrest. In fact, I'm pretty sure I saw you drop a baggie of fentanyl under the seat just now. Then, Malcolm's voice. You're going to plant drugs on us? And finally, Foley's own fatal confession, loud and clear. I don't have to plant anything. I'll find a brick of fentanyl in this cruiser, and a judge will take my word over yours. You're done. Reyes tapped the screen, cutting the audio. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than concrete. Foley was shaking. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His career, his freedom, his entire life was playing back to him on a damning loop. The street thugs he thought he could break had just handed him a federal prison sentence wrapped in a bow. Captain Donahue stood up, his face flushed with disgust. Brendan Foley, you are a disgrace to this badge. You are a disgrace to this department. Jenkins walked over to him, extending an open hand. Badge and gun, Foley, Jenkins commanded. You're done. Brendan Foley stared at Lieutenant Jenkins' outstretched hand, his breathing shallow and rapid. The silence in Captain Donahue's office was absolute, broken only by the faint, mocking hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The reality of his situation crashed over him like a suffocating wave. He wasn't just facing a reprimand or a temporary suspension. He was looking at the obliteration of his entire existence. With trembling fingers, Foley unclasped his gun belt. The heavy leather rig, holding his department-issued Glock, spare magazines, and the very handcuffs he had used to bind 2 federal detectives just an hour prior, hit Donahue's desk with a dull, heavy thud. Next came the badge. The shiny silver shield he had used as a weapon of intimidation clattered unceremoniously against the wood. Turn around, Foley, Jenkins ordered, her voice devoid of any sympathy. She unclipped her own cuffs. "Sarah, please," Foley choked out, his arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by the pathetic whimper of a bully finally cornered. "I have 20 years in. My pension. You can't do this." "You did this to yourself, Brendan," Donahue said, turning his back to the disgraced officer, unable to even look at him. Title 18. United States Code, Section 242. Deprivation of rights, under color of law. "You're a federal prisoner now." The metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs locking around Foley's wrists echoed like a judge's gavel. Down the hall, Desk Sergeant O'Malley was sorting through a stack of overnight reports when he saw Captain Reyes and Captain Donahue striding purposefully toward holding cell 3. O'Malley quickly stood up. "Captains, I haven't processed those 2 assault suspects yet." Reyes didn't even acknowledge O'Malley. He walked straight to the iron bars, pulling a key from Donahue's hand, and unlocked the heavy door. It swung open with a screech. Inside, Malcolm and Tyrone were sitting casually on the hard metal benches. They looked up as Reyes entered. "You boys cut it pretty close tonight," Reyes said, a rare, faint smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Just wanted to make sure you were awake, boss," Tyrone replied, standing up and stretching his broad shoulders. He turned his back so Reyes could unlock the cuffs Foley had slapped on him. Malcolm followed suit, rubbing his chafed wrists as the steel fell away. O'Malley's jaw practically hit the floor. "Captain Donahue, what is going on?" Foley said. "These guys were gangbangers. They assaulted him." "Sergeant O'Malley," Donahue sighed heavily. "Meet Detective Hayes and Detective Evans, Organized Crime Task Force. And as for Foley, he won't be joining us for the morning briefing, or ever again." Just then, Lieutenant Jenkins marched Foley down the central corridor of the precinct. The booking area, usually a hive of chaotic noise, fell dead silent. Every officer on the night shift stopped what they were doing. Young Officer Jim Paulson, standing by the coffee machine, went pale as a sheet. He watched his supposed mentor, the man who had pressured him to lie on an official police report just 20 minutes ago, doing the perp walk in his own station. Foley kept his head down, his face burning with a profound, inescapable humiliation. As he was paraded past the holding cell, he locked eyes with Malcolm and Tyrone. The 2 undercover detectives didn't gloat. They didn't sneer. They just looked at him with the cold, professional indifference one reserves for taking out the trash. That absolute dismissal hurt Foley more than any insult could have. There was no time for Malcolm and Tyrone to celebrate Foley's downfall. The clock was ticking. Operation Iron Tide was still fully active, and they had a noon meeting with Jimmy, the Rat, and the elusive cartel boss, Dominic Rossi. In a bizarre twist of fate, the altercation at Frankie's Copper Kettle actually provided the perfect cover story. When Malcolm and Tyrone showed up at the waterfront warehouse that afternoon, looking bruised, exhausted, and carrying a gritty, aggressive energy, Jimmy, the Rat, demanded to know where they had been. "Got jammed up by a dirty uniform on the east side," Malcolm spat, playing his Jamal persona to perfection. "Cop tried to shake us down for a brick. Had to pay our way out just to make this meet. I'm not in the mood for games, Jimmy." The story resonated perfectly with the cartel's worldview. It cemented their street credibility. Dominic Rossi, a paranoid man who rarely showed his face, bought the narrative completely. He stepped out from the shadows of the warehouse, flanked by armed guards, to personally inspect the money Malcolm and Tyrone had brought. "You boys handle yourselves well under pressure," Rossi murmured in his thick, raspy voice. "I respect that. Bring the shipment in." The moment Rossi gave the order, and the crates of narcotics were cracked open, Tyrone tapped his smartwatch. The warehouse doors blew inward. Flashbang grenades detonated with blinding white light and deafening concussive force. Over 50 heavily armed SWAT operators swarmed the building from every conceivable angle. Helicopters thumped rhythmically overhead. The raid was flawless. Rossi, Jimmy, the Rat, and 14 syndicate enforcers were on the ground in zip ties within 90 seconds. 14 months of grueling, dangerous undercover work culminated in the largest narcotics seizure in the state's history. 8 months later, the hard karma Foley had set into motion finally reached its devastating conclusion. The sterile, oak-paneled walls of the federal district court offered no comfort. Brendan Foley sat at the defense table, looking utterly diminished. Without his uniform, his badge, and his gun, he was just a small, aging man in a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit. The trial had been a massacre. Federal prosecutor Jonathan Adler hadn't even needed to call Malcolm or Tyrone to the stand to testify about the diner incident. The Title III wiretap audio did all the heavy lifting. When the jury heard Foley's arrogant, venomous voice echoing through the courtroom, explicitly threatening to plant fentanyl on 2 innocent black men, the collective gasp from the gallery sealed his fate. Foley's defense attorney tried to argue that it was merely tough talk meant to elicit a confession, a recognized, albeit aggressive, police tactic. But Honorable Judge Evelyn Carter, a no-nonsense jurist with zero tolerance for police corruption, saw right through the pathetic facade. "Mr. Foley," Judge Carter said, peering over her glasses as she prepared to deliver the sentence, "you were entrusted with a badge, a firearm, and the profound authority to enforce the law. Instead, you weaponized that authority to terrorize citizens based on your own malicious prejudices. You did not protect and serve. You hunted and fabricated. You are the exact reason the public loses faith in the justice system." Foley stared at the floor, a single tear of self-pity rolling down his cheek. For the civil rights violations, the false arrest, and the documented intent to distribute and plant Class A narcotics, Judge Carter's voice rang out with absolute finality. "I sentence you to 96 months in a maximum security federal penitentiary. You are remanded into the custody of the United States Marshals. Court is adjourned." The gavel slammed down. It was a heavy, echoing sound that signaled the end of Brendan Foley's reign of terror. As the marshals hauled him away to begin his 8-year sentence, far away from the city he had poisoned, Malcolm Hayes and Tyrone Evans were already back on the streets, wearing different faces, working a different angle, holding the line in the shadows. The staggering downfall of Brendan Foley serves as a chilling reminder of the destructive nature of unchecked authority. When prejudice masquerades as justice, it poisons the entire system. Malcolm and Tyrone's unwavering professionalism not only dismantled a massive criminal syndicate, but also excised a dangerous predator from their own ranks. Real justice requires vigilance, accountability, and the courage to expose corruption wherever it hides, even behind a shiny silver badge.